Good morning and welcome to the IAF Road to Geelong podcast, or in this case, our video interview. So I'm Carolyn Smith and I'm your host for this morning. And today I'm talking with Sue Langley,
Hi, everyone.
who is hosting a workshop at the 2026 IAF Oceania Conference in Geelong, 14 to 17 October. So welcome to you, Sue.
Thank you, Carolyn. Very happy to be here.
Lovely to have you. We're going to dive straight in with asking you, where are you calling from today?
I am dialing in from the lands of the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation up here in Suffolk Park, not far from Byron Bay.
Fabulous. And just to let everyone know, I'm calling in from Whangarei, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So, can you just give us a short description of your field of facilitation?
My area of expertise is I suppose, the psychology of humans. I spend all my time saying, how can I make a positive difference to global human flourishing? And I do that through the science of positive psychology, emotional intelligence, and neuroscience. And I try and get a holistic human systems approach when I facilitate.
Excellent. So, what first drew you into into the neuroscience behind facilitation?
I started really in the emotional intelligence space because I was always fascinated by emotions. They drive so much of who we are, what we do, whether it's relationships and how they go astray or not, whether it's how we look after our well-being, or whether it's how we learn. Emotions are such a fundamental piece. Emotions underpin leadership, teamwork, all sorts of things. So that was kind of where I started. And then I realized emotional intelligence and positive psychology were kind of one and the same thing, really. I mean, lots of people probably say they're not, but to me, they're kind of two halves of an orange. You can't really pull them apart. Like if you have high levels of well-being, you are probably better at managing your emotions and self-regulation, etc. And you can't really understand emotions without understanding what goes on in the brain. So, from a neuroscience and neurobiology perspective. So, I did my master's in neuroscience of leadership because I was really interested in what goes on in the brain and how it impacts our ability to learn, to make good decisions, to deal with change, to self-regulate, all of those sorts of things. Innovation. I did my thesis on neuroscience of innovation. And therefore, when I facilitate, I try and bring the science of positive psychology, emotional intelligence, and neuroscience into my facilitation. So everything that I do when I facilitate has a purpose. I will never do an icebreaker for the sake of doing an icebreaker. I know that probably goes against what some people do, but I will never do an icebreaker just for to do an icebreaker. Everything always has the science behind it, and I try to do activities based on neuroscience, and then I teach the science behind it so people understand why. And my job has always been to share knowledge and facilitate learning. That's what I do. That's my whole ethos of what I do. But I've been lucky that people have said to me, "You're a really good facilitator. Can they learn to facilitate with me?" And so I've been, yeah, lucky that people have sought me out to say, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I just use the science to try and increase learning." So I'm excited to share some of those thoughts.
Excellent. It's really interesting to hear that because it sounds like there's this dual passion for you, which is the science of, I guess, connecting and engaging and working with people, as well as the actual facilitation of it. So is it a chicken and egg?
I suppose I'm really interested. So, my own personal purpose is to breathe spirit into the minds of others to achieve their level of excellence, as in for you to be the best person you can be, for me to be the best person I can be more frequently. We don't have to be perfect all the time. And so, how do I work with leaders? How do I work with people to try and help them be the best they can be? And I do that through sharing knowledge. But sharing knowledge isn't enough. And I have a saying, you know it till you do it. So many people know what to do, don't necessarily do it. If I am doing a session on well-being, I'll often say to people, I don't need to teach you well-being. You already know what to do, but for some reason you're not doing it. So let's explore how we get it to doing it. And many facilitators will know this. You've got really good stuff to share. It doesn't mean to say people are going to use it at the end of it. They might have a nice time on the day, but are they actually going to deliver? Are they going to do it? Are they going to change their behavior and those sorts of things? So for me, it's facilitation is a way to help people be the best they can be. And because I suppose I'm a bit of a science nerd, I love the science, I love the research. I don't just like a model for the sake of a model. I try and keep up to date, which isn't easy in the positive psychology space because it's exploded. Um, but there are things that, sometimes people are still teaching that have been debunked. And you see them in leadership programs that people are facilitating. And I'm like, oh, did you not realize? Like MBTI was debunked over 20 years ago. And yet people still teach MBTI as a tool.
Can you just explain to some of us who don't know what MBTI stands for?
Yeah, so MBTI is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and
Oh,
Myers-Briggs type indicator MBTI has been used for many, many years, and it's still being used in organizations. And yet, literally over 20 years ago, it was debunked. It's not a great tool. Now, any tool is only as good as the conversation that comes from it. Um, but as a facilitator, I think when we are sharing knowledge, facilitating learning, etc., we ideally want to keep up to date with what's new. And again, that's just me. I like the science. I like the research. Stuff that I teach, I let people know where it's been critiqued and where it's, been supported, etc. Because I think if we can teach people the stuff that helps people do their job in a way that we know works, then hopefully we get better outcomes.
absolutely. Um, it's interesting what you said because I think about the a number of frameworks are built around Myers-Briggs, so I'm assuming those also need to be rethought.
Probably do.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, I'd love to just nip back a moment to what you were talking about icebreakers, because there's a lot of conversation about icebreakers in the facilitation world and this idea of connection over content as well, and the importance of building connection, and they kind of get blurred together, I think. So I'm
Yeah.
curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Oh, look, everybody's different. And some people say, oh, you need an icebreaker at the beginning and stuff like that. I always think as a good facilitator, your content can become connection. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You do an exercise for connection and then you do an activity around content. I don't see why we can't be doing the two together. And so for me, there's never an exercise that I do that doesn't have a purpose that's sharing some of the science. Now, people might not think it initially. I do an activity with our Inspire Action cards. So we have these set of Inspire Action cards that I just call best mood, worst mood. And people probably assume, oh, it's an icebreaker. But actually, the purpose of the activity is it sets the scene so that even if I've got reluctant people on a program, by the time I've done that exercise and then explained the science behind it, they can't help but be engaged because they have just told me why emotions are important. Now, they don't know that at the time. They probably just think they're doing an icebreaker. But by the time we've finished and we then get into the science of emotions, they now can't escape from the fact that they need to pay attention because they just told me why emotions are important. And I remember having this once. I had a lovely gentleman on a program. We were rolling out a one-day wellbeing program for across an organization, about 3,000 people. And one particular chap, he was from New Zealand, and I had about 30 people in the room. And we did a quick whip round just to say hi because people didn't know each other. And it was very quick with 30 people, but just a quick whip round the room. And he was this lovely, well, he didn't appear lovely at the time. He was probably 6'6". I found out later he's an ex-rugby player. He'd actually been an All Black. And he sat with a fluoro vest on, big beard, 6'6", with his arms folded at the back. And we got to him and he just went, I've been voluntold to be here. I'm like, okay. We did the best mood, worst mood activity. And then I got got to the neuroscience, how the brain works, etc. By morning tea, you wouldn't have even known he was reluctant. He was engaged. He was engaged all day. He later came on one of our 6-day positive leadership programs. He was the most engaged person. He was just amazing. And what was really cool is the following year on the same 6-day leadership program, we had 25 people and we got to a particular exercise. And one chap put up his hand and he said, I was the recipient of this particular activity last year. And he said, I want you all to know this made my day because it's an activity people balk at. They initially do not want to do the activity. And he said, you need to know, even though you feel awkward, this made my day last year. And he continued to say, he said, I've been so lucky I've taken over a team that all this stuff we're learning, he said, I realize my team are all doing this. He said, I only took them over early this year. They're amazing. They're already doing the strength stuff. They're already using positive communication. They do gratitude. They've flipped the way they do meetings. He said, my team is amazing that I've taken over. And I said, oh, cool. Who did you take it over from? Mr. Voluntold, that 2 years previously did not want to come on a program. So that to me is when you teach people the science, and these were a bunch of engineers as well, so they needed the science. And I think for me, any activity that I do has to illustrate a point. Because, and I suppose, sorry, Carolyn, I'm waffling now, but I've been in sessions myself where, I've been about to do a keynote and I'm following somebody else. And somebody says, okay, I want everybody to stand up. And first of all, as soon as you want me to do something, I don't want to do it. So I immediately feel reluctant. But I remember being in one recently and somebody said, oh, I want you all to stand up. And they were lovely, lovely person on stage, great. And we all stood up and they said, okay, so just look around the room, see who you can see, and give them all a smile. And then, okay, I want you all to sit down. And I'm literally like, are you kidding me? You have just got me to, for no reason. That was it. There was no debrief afterwards. There was no why we were doing it. And it was almost like we were just being manipulated by a facilitator who can say, do this and we'll all do it. And
Mm,
I find that offensive.
mm. No, it's so interesting because I'm imagining maybe for the facilitator, they may have been thinking, oh, let's get some energy going before the
Absolutely.
next person,
Yeah.
but they didn't say that.
Yeah.
And also that comment you make about telling people versus inviting.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's so interesting. It's something I personally am very passionate about too.
Well,
Activities need to have a purpose and relate to why
yeah.
we're there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it's the more you learn about facilitation, my curiosity is around often we talk about creating safe spaces. And I was challenged once when I said that by someone who said, well, what does that look like? Can you create a safe space? We unpacked it and decided you can't. You can create or help or hope to create, say, inclusive or
Yeah.
productive or engaging, but safe. So I'm curious, Sue, to hear your thoughts on that and this idea of what kind of space a facilitator creates.
Yeah. Look, I understand the concept of safe space, as in safe for people to speak up and things like that. But I sometimes think as a facilitator, your job is also to create a challenging space,
Mm,
to challenge people's thinking, to encourage people to get outside of themselves in some way. Um, I suppose there was one particular lady, and I'll never forget. She was again, it was about a year or so ago, and she's been on a few of my programs, and she's in a relatively senior leadership role, but she's quite quiet and more introverted in her preference. And she came up to me in a break, and she said, "May I give you a hug?" And I'm like, okay, she's not the sort of person that would just be effusively hugging. And I said, of course. And she said, you're one of the best facilitators I've ever worked with because you gently hold us while challenging us. And I thought that was one of the nicest pieces of feedback because safe space, as I say, I get it. You want people to feel safe, but sometimes you want to challenge and hold them while they don't fall apart potentially, or support in that way. How you do that, I'm never entirely sure. I do think it's around I do think it's around language. So I teach a lot of people about positive communication and positive language. And so to your point, in a session, I will never want people to do anything. I will always ask or invite them to do something because you want to pull people towards what you do want. So I think language is important and also how you respond to people. And I suppose because I spend most of my time talking about emotions and the brain and things like that, for me, any emotion is valid. So if, for instance, somebody says they're nervous, I will often say, oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I will never say, oh, don't worry, we'll settle in a moment. You won't feel nervous soon, because that would be saying their nervousness is wrong, and nervous isn't wrong. It's just an emotion. So I think there are elements of that around that's the safety, as in whatever somebody feels, it's okay. Whatever somebody says may not be okay. As in, just because you feel safe and you want to say whatever you want to say, maybe that's not appropriate for the other people in the room. And sometimes as a facilitator, you will know, Carolyn, you have to have side conversations or you have to shut something down because it's inappropriate. I had something recently, and again, bearing in mind a lot of the work I do, it can go quite deep, as in sometimes people tell me stuff about their past and their background and their thoughts that I really don't want to know. But so I get a lot of practice of people sharing deep, dark, and meaningful stuff. But I had a group recently. It was a relatively small group where somebody had some quite strong opinions, which part of me shares, as in, we can all do whatever we want to do and we can all pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and it doesn't matter and we can, achieve whatever we want to achieve and all this. And part of me kind of agrees with that. And they were so believing of it themselves and they'd been through hardship and they'd got themselves out of it, etc. But I also knew somebody else in the room had just had a very close family member who just ended their life. And I could see that this was feeling quite offensive because it was almost like, well, this person's family member should have been able to do that. And so it was a bit like, okay, I need to now contain the enthusiasm from one person who feels supposedly safe to say whatever they want to say and challenge them because of the safety of another person. Does that
Mm,
make sense? So
yeah.
I don't know if safe, like people talk a lot about psychological safety, and sometimes people interpret psychological safety as I can say whatever I want to say whenever I want to say it. And that is not psychological safety. Because psychological safety is using your emotional intelligence to say, do you know what, right now is not the time to say this, but I am going to have a side conversation with that person afterwards because that's a more appropriate time. So I think as a facilitator, it's juggling safety with challenge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know in the beginning of sessions, I often invite people to contribute what they think will help in terms of what they want from me or from each other, from themselves. And listening to you, I'm thinking almost without fail, people will want from me to be challenged.
Mm. Yeah.
Yes, I think you're onto something. There's a lot, isn't there? There's layers and layers and layers that sit there through language and all that design. I'm curious around how you approach design. So when you're coming into a session, what does the design process look like for you, Sue?
Show up. I don't know. I'm not very big on the design piece. Um, I guess because I know my content. All the content that I teach is my own. So I have like 50 days of content. I have 25 years of knowledge of research, etc. So design is probably not something I spend time on. I'm not suggesting other people shouldn't. And when I started out, I probably spent a lot more time on design. But now I think I trust myself. I trust my participants. I kind of know what the outcomes are, and I trust myself to get there. But I think the other thing is I do trust the participants to get there. And again, I always believe if you think about what the word facilitate means, it means to ease. That's what we do. Our job is
Oh,
to ease
yes.
learning. And so I think as participants, as long as they're engaged and things like that, they will drive things. And also, I remember somebody once said to me ages ago, from a coaching perspective, just remember the person asking the questions is in control of the conversation. And as a facilitator, your job is a big coach, really. You're asking questions. And so as long as your questions are good, they will guide the conversation where it needs to go. And I have to admit, one of my favorite things to do now is and it started with a global client that they just wanted to have quarterly sessions that they just called it Ask Sue. And basically, people had been on various webinars with me. And this particular sort of part of the business, they wanted to have a quarterly session where people could just ask me anything with no topic and no agenda. And I loved it. It was really good for stretching me. And I have to say, and this is a global client, so the very first session that I was on, and a lot of people were in Europe, and it was just after the war in Ukraine had started, probably a few months after. And I was getting asked questions that, as a leader, when I've got somebody who's just fled the Ukraine and they're living somewhere where they have none of their things around them and they've had to leave their family behind, how do I handle the emotions? I had questions like, I've got a family living in my house, and I'm trying to take care of them, but I know they're still in distress after what's happened. And this is a corporate client,
Wow.
and this is what leaders are asking me. And I loved the fact that my facilitation skills allowed me to not give answers, but to explore with the group how, though I could give the science of emotions, but the group as a whole were facilitating ideas and answers. And so I have to admit, since then, that particular client, every quarter, there's about 5,000 people jump on and they can ask me anything they like around leadership, emotions, psych, neuroscience, etc. And whether I have answers or not, because again, facilitator's job is not often to provide answers. One of the loveliest things was somebody posted on LinkedIn afterwards. I feel like I've just had a therapy session with my best friend. And I'm like, if you feel like that with 5,000 people on a call, then hopefully I'm doing something right. And again, it's not me, it's the group that create that, I think. Um,
Wow, that's really powerful.
yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
and it stretches me as a facilitator, so that's good.
I love it. I guess one of my questions was, what do you notice? What are you paying attention to first when you walk into a room? Which, given you intuitively, I would say, suggest facilitate, from what you're saying. I'm really interested in your answer to that when you walk in. What do you pay
Uh,
attention to first?
Emotions.
Mm.
And I'll give you a beautiful example of this. So I spend a lot of my time, as I say, in the emotion space, and I when I first started in this space, there's a particular test you can do around your emotional intelligence called the Mesquite, and one of them I scored really poorly in about 20 years ago, which is reading emotions in people's faces. So I spent a year reading the books, testing myself for 1 hour a month on facial action coding and how the micro expressions worked. I went to the States and did a 2 week course on facial action coding system, every muscle in the face. And when I took that test again a few years later, I got the highest score possible. It's like, okay, I've got better at that. And to give you an example, micro expressions appear on your face involuntarily. So even if you've got a good poker face, you will experience micro expressions that give away your emotions. In fact, our final exam on this course was world poker finalists. Could we see the moment that they'd been dealt the card that gave them the winning hand by the micro expression? And I remember facilitating a program. It was in Auckland, and it was for a particular bank, and they had these really cool training rooms that were containers, shipping containers. And where I went in, I set up the room, and because I was doing a Leading with Emotional Intelligence program, on that program we don't have tables, we have a U shape of chairs, which some people find uncomfortable because a table gives us something to hide behind, etc. There's a barrier. So because of this particular program, it's, relatively senior for leaders, etc. I take the tables away and I just had this U-shape of chairs. So anyway, so I'm set up, etc. And as people came in, there were 12 participants, and on 11 of them, I saw a micro expression of either disgust or contempt. So 11 out of 12. And the only reason I didn't see it on the 12th is because I wasn't facing them when they came in. So it may have been there, but I didn't see it. But what's really cool, understanding emotions, is that's a micro expression. And it made sense because disgust is something or someone is offensive to me. And they were probably like, oh God, there's no tables. Oh God, what's this going to be about? It's kumbaya around a campfire. We're talking about emotions. So that made sense. And contempt usually has an element of, I'm better than you, I'm looking down on. So both of those emotions made complete sense to me. And I didn't let them derail or anything. By morning tea, again, everyone's engaged. We've done best mid, worst mid, we've done the neuroscience, all this sort of stuff. Everybody's like, oh, this is great. We get to the end of the day and the day one, and one of these senior leaders comes up to me and she said, excuse me, she said, can I tell you a secret? I said, yeah, of course. And she said, I didn't want to be here this morning. And I said, can I tell you a secret? She said, yes. I said, I know. But that's what I mean. That's what I look for. I look for those micro expressions. I look for it as people are going through the day. Sometimes I'll say to somebody, oh, Carolyn, you have a question. And the person will go, yeah, yeah, I did. How did you know? And it's like, because I'm watching your face. Now, you don't always see it, but because it's what I teach, I try to be really attuned to the physiology of somebody, the emotions that they're experiencing, so that I can call on them in a way that makes them feel, again, comfortable, safe to share whatever they want to share. And because it's what I'm teaching, I kind of have to demonstrate those things at certain points. So I love that. I love seeing what people are feeling.
So fascinating. And you know, our 30 minutes has flown by. So in our last few minutes, I guess we want to talk about your session at the IAF conference. So what can people expect?
Well, the session that I'm doing in the main part of the conference is really thinking about the future element. We hear a lot about AI at the moment and how to use AI. I'm going to be bringing it to, in the age of AI, the future is human. So, what are the human elements, and how do we use those human elements in a way that really support our outcomes, I suppose. So I'm really looking forward to that session and perhaps doing things a little bit differently. And I'm also looking forward to the pre-conference workshop because I think that's going to be really fun of delving into the neuroscience and the post psych.
Excellent. I guess who do you think will get the most out of attending?
Well, as a conference, I don't know because I mean it's my first time going, so I'm excited. For me personally, I think if you're a facilitator, there's often you get better through practice. There's lots of things that you can learn, etc. And I remember doing one for a corporate client once, a 2 day sort of presentation facilitation session. And I remember one lady who was a really consummate keynote professional in her field. And she said by morning tea, she said, I have learnt more that I could leave now and it would still be worth it. And it's sometimes the simple things. Like I was talking to somebody the other day about, using the B key on your keyboard and blanking out the slides. And they're like, oh, I didn't even know you could do that. So sometimes, to your point, Carolyn, I think anything you learn of those little tiny technical things, like I've had AV people wonder why the screen's gone blank behind me when I'm doing a keynote. And it's because I've blanked it because I want people to pay attention to me, not what's on the screen. So sometimes it's the tiny little things that you pick up, and sometimes it's the bigger things. And I think there are some people talking about some really cool new stuff. As I say, my session on the future is human is about let's think of things for the future that's going to drive us forward. And still thinking about that human element because there's lots of change. People often are not learning things the same way because we can just look it up. We can get AI to tell us that we're actually not learning stuff, in which case that's impacting our ability to critically think about things. And when we critically think about things, then we embed them, etc. So I think anything you can learn as a facilitator to be better at what you do, you're holding people in your hands sometimes for hours or days. Let's hold them well.
I love that. So where can people find you, Sue? You on LinkedIn? Do you have a website?
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at langley.com.au or suelangley.com. Yeah, I think I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and don't do much on there. And otherwise, LinkedIn is probably the main place. Or just email me, sue@langley.com.au. I will respond to every and any email that comes in.
Well, thank you so much for your generosity today. It's
It's
been
been a
such a pleasure talking to you. I feel like I could have talked to you for hours.
pleasure. Thanks,
So,
Kat.
yeah, so that brings us to the end of the show. And if you enjoyed it, please share with other facilitators. And also, for more information about the conference or IAF Oceania, please visit our website, facilitationinaction.com.au. So, and join us for future episodes. That's it. Thank you. Bye.